The issue has always been, Denise, will I be able to make an elective deferral pursuant to my salary reduction agreement by virtue of these checks I'm going to receive? Can I shelter some of those funds into my 403B? Well, we have answered that question in the regulations by stating that when an individual leaves service, as to only 3 types of compensation that they receive afterwards. Their regular pay, which, as I talked a moment ago about the various elements that could be included therein, their accrued but unused vacation, their accrued but unused sick pay. As to those 3 items, they can make an elective deferral after they've left. And this is very, very interesting, because what it says is you have up until the later of the end of the year in which you leave service, or 2.5 months, to make that elective deferral. Now let's see for a moment how that would work in the case of an individual participant. Oh, let's say, for example, a school teacher. He or she is leaving service on June 30th of 2007, let's say, for an example. That means that as to these checks for regular pay, vacation, or sick pay that would be coming to them after he or she has left service, they would have up until December 31st of 2007 of making that contribution. But let's also remember that they have an overall limit on the elective deferrals that they could make for the 2007 year. Under optimum conditions, that could be as much as $23,500. Well, if they were contributing the max, knowing they were leaving at the end of June, they may have already filled up that limit. So if they did, those checks would come, they would have no limit left to defer from those particular checks. However, let's take that same individual. He or she leaves service on, November 30th. If my math would be correct, and correct me if I'm wrong, I believe that individual would have 2.5 months after November 30th. That would be December, January, up to somewhere around February 15th to receive those checks and make a deferral from them. And into the 2008 year, they would pick up an entirely new elective deferral limit. And that limit is ordinarily indexed each year, so we don't know what it would be in subsequent years to 2007. But if that individual planned ahead, he or she would be able to optimize the ability to continue tax deferral of those funds into a following year when they pick up a brand new limitation. So this is something people have to watch out for, but it's important to understand that these are only for regular pay paid after one leaves, sick pay, and vacation pay. Now let's talk about the logistics of how they would do it. They've been contributing for years by a salary reduction agreement. Well, let's say that salary reduction agreement specified $200 a pay period to be deferred to the 403B, or, for example, 5% of my pay I'd like my salary reduced by to be contributing to my 403B. Well, what would happen if after they leave, and I know some of these checks for accrued but unused sick and vacation pay can be somewhat sizable, what would happen if they received a check for $80,000 and they had a salary reduction agreement in place that said $200? Well, that certainly wouldn't optimize the opportunity of what they could do to make a maximum deferral, particularly if they were in a brand new year with a brand new limitation. So they can, within the time after they leave, even up to that point, as long as the funds have not been paid or made available to them, they could go in and alter that salary reduction agreement to actually encompass the larger size check that they would receive. So these are important considerations for people to make.
I understand that for such things as the long-term employee catch-up, you would need to know the number of years of service that the employee has worked. Do the regulations go into that? Well,
absolutely. There are a couple of items in the world of 403B that you really need to know how long people have worked. Certainly for that 15-year catch-up, which is known as, under the Internal Revenue Code, the 402G7 catch-up, and also for includable compensation. Remember, I talked about the overall limit basically is the lesser of 100% of includable compensation or $45,000, that being the 2007 overall limit. Well, to understand one's includable compensation, we have to know their most recent year of service to compute that on. So, for instance, for the catch-up, where you have to have worked for that employer for 15 or more full years before you're entitled to that potential additional $3,000, or even to determine the years of service to base your includable compensation on, you have to know how many years an individual has worked. So the regulations, and particularly the examples under this section, go in depth into how one determines years of service. For example, you could have people that work full-time for part of the year, or you could have people that work part-time for the entire year. So it's very important under those rather challenging circumstances to determine what their years of service actually are for the items that I had just enumerated. And it's very important that the regulations point out that those years of service are really the employee's annual work period, not their taxable year. Because we know if you, for example, are at a university, the work period is most likely going to be based on semesters. So it's actually the employee's annual work period, not necessarily their taxable year. Sometimes they could overlap, but in other instances, particularly higher education, they may not. So it's very worthwhile looking at the examples and the discussion and the regulations that deals with years of service.
B has a very unique feature concerning post-severance contributions. Bob, what do the regulations say about this?
Well, I'm glad you mentioned that, Bernice, because this is probably one of the most unique and interesting provisions that 403B has that, to my knowledge, doesn't appear in any type of other retirement plan that sponsoring employers can offer their individual employees. This is a feature that allows the employer to contribute to the individual's 403B for up to 5 years after they've left service. Let's take that same individual that we talked about earlier who leaves on June 30th of 2007. That organization has until the end of 2007, those 6 remaining months, and then 5 years more to make contributions to their 403B within the maximum legal overall limit. Now, we discussed the overall limit for defined contribution plans is $45,000. Projecting $45,000 out over 5 years is $225,000. That's a lot of money, and as you could well imagine, because of all that money, sometimes this generates a good deal of salivation on the part of people to capitalize on this unique 403B benefit. The catch with this benefit, it's not really a catch, but the rule with the benefit is that it be done with non-elective contributions only. This must be the employer's money. It may not be accomplished via a salary reduction agreement. And what I mean by that is as follows. Let's talk about that accrued but unused sick pay that many people get after they leave service, which can result in a rather sizable check. Well, they get this check or they're about to get the check in cash, but they know, they have heard that their aunt's cousin's mother's sister's son just became a financial advisor, and he heard about this 5-year provision just before he fell asleep one night. So